Really happy to have everyone here. And my name is Nick McWilliam. I am the co-editor at Alborada. If it's your first time at an Alborada event, which is, they're normally physical events, but this is one we're doing, well, obviously online, as several of our previous ones have been. A little background on Alborada. It's an online platform which was started around 10 years ago to offer a different perspective on Latin American politics, media and culture to that of the mainstream. The focus is on grassroots, social movements and progressive politics. A couple of things before I introduce our guests who are going to talk about Bolivia. There's a couple of things to tell you about. First, we recently published a digital magazine, which you can get a free copy of, which will be posted in the link, in the chat. So just send us an email and we'll be happy to send you one of those. It includes articles on the coup in Bolivia, as well as a whole load of other decent stuff and very, very interesting reading. Please do get yourself a copy if you haven't yet done so. Also, Alborada is a completely independent operation. We all do this on a voluntary basis. If you are able to support, please do. We have a crowdfunder that is going, and the link to that will also be in the chat. So please do support Alborada if you can, and any support you can give, and please share the crowdfunder and let people know that they can also get hold of the magazine. We would really, really appreciate any help and support and promotion you can give on that. A couple of other things. We have two more events, online events coming up soon. On the 14th of June, we have Chile's social uprising and COVID-19. That's at 3:30 p.m. UK time. That's on Sunday, the 14th of June, looking at how COVID has impacted on the massive protest movement that's been going on in Chile for several months now. And then just 2 days after that, on the 16th of June, we have another event that's at 8 p.m. UK time, Tuesday the 16th of June, How the Media Reports on Latin America. The links to both of those events will also be in the chat of this that is in front of you now. So feel free to register, and yeah, we hope to see you then as well. So really, really pleased to be able to introduce two very, very good speakers, two people who've done a lot of coverage of the coup, the build-up and the subsequent events in Bolivia. Our first speaker is Olivia Arigho-Stiles. She is an Alborada contributing editor. She is a London-based PhD researcher exploring 20th century Bolivian politics. And Olivia was actually in Bolivia when the coup occurred. Ollie Vargas is a Bolivian journalist at Kawaskan News in Bolivia and a contributor at Mint Press News. After they speak, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask any questions. We'll have an extended Q&A session, so please do feel free to raise some questions. You do have the opportunity to ask the question yourself. Just to let you know, we're filming this event and we will release it. So if you'd rather not appear on the film, please just write your question in the chat and then I will read it out to them. So thanks again. And on that note, I would like to bring in Olivia to tell us about her experiences of being in the country and what else has been going on.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think it's a really, really good time, a really important time to revisit what happened last year in Bolivia and to draw attention to what is a catastrophic situation for human rights there right now, exacerbated, I think, by the COVID restrictions of recent weeks. So I'm going to speak very briefly because I'm conscious we've got Ollie Vargas here who's been there doing amazing reporting on the ground. So I'm going to start by taking us back to last year, giving a brief overview of the coup and the events preceding the coup. And I'll talk briefly about some of the longer term developments and historical context around this current juncture and some of the longer term strategies deployed by the Bolivian ultra-right and their international allies. So as we know, a coup took place in Bolivia in November last year when President Evo Morales was forced to resign at the behest of the military following a police mutiny in cities across the country. This had come after 2 weeks of mass mobilization by anti-government protesters who accused the government of fraud in the elections on the 20th of October. These accusations of fraud were fueled by the Organization of American States, the OAS, who in haste had released a report claiming that there were irregularities in the voting data. The claims in that report have been refuted by US think tank, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. But in a way, I think whether there was actually fraud in those specific preliminary results, so not even the actual results, it almost doesn't matter, because that there was a perception of fraud is clear, or at least fraud was chosen as the outward justification for mobilization. And it seems to me now that this charge of fraud, which was so widely disseminated at the time, I think went beyond that one specific moment or that specific set of results, because Morales had even backed down. He'd said, look, we'll hold a second round when he was faced with these protests, but by then it just wasn't enough. So fraud became almost a metaphor, an abstraction. It was an umbrella term for what right-wing bourgeois elites, I think for them it was a crisis of legitimacy, and nothing could address that but the removal of Morales. So then the election result unleashed a wave of violence by these protesters against the mass and mass supporters across the country, which as it unfolded was steered by alt-right business leader Luis Fernando Camacho. Camacho was then the head of the regional group in Santa Cruz, the Pro Santa Cruz Committee. He has ties to fascist youth groups. When the military then suggested that Morales resign, this was the breaking point that forced Morales to leave. But by this time, houses of prominent Masista politicians had been burnt down, including the house of Morales' sister. In the days prior to the coup, a mass mayor, Patricia Arce Guzman, was attacked. She was, this hit the headlines here as well, I think. She was dragged into the street, her hair was cut off. At the same time, the director of radio for the Land Workers Union, the Sesut Sebe, a long-term ally of Morales, the union represents rural, usually indigenous workers, he was chained to a tree while anti-government protesters ransacked the union's headquarters. So in the wake of Morales' resignation, we had a gaping power vacuum combined with rising political violence and retribution. And in this space, a new interim president maneuvered herself into position. That's evangelical conservative opposition politician Janine Áñez, who represented a party that received just 4% of the votes in the elections. She was in line for the presidency because the vice president had resigned, the heads of both chambers of Congress had resigned in the face of these threats of violence. In the aftermath of the coup, the government then immediately launched a brutal crackdown on anti-coup protesters and mass supporters. And in just a 2-week window, at least 30 civilians were killed and 700 injured by police military forces as they protested against the coup. In Sacaba, in the Cocogoin-Chapari region in Bolivia, some peaceful protesters were shot, according to reports, from a helicopter. When I was in La Paz at the time, and there were 9 protesters blocking the gas plant in Sencata, near El Alto, they were shot dead by police military forces, including one who was a student. The families had brought the coffins down into La Paz for a funeral march. It's incredibly emotional, incredibly fraught. And then the police just came and chucked a load of tear gas, and the coffins were left on the tarmac in the hot sun. So there was clearly a very brutal crackdown on protest and on the mass party, and an attempt to intimidate and criminalize mass political activity. One of the other major points to note, and I think Ollie may talk about this more, but the coup saw the resurgence and the re-articulation of a very old pattern of racism. So Morales was famously the first indigenous president in Bolivia. According to the last national census in 2012, 40% of Bolivia, the Bolivian population identified as a member of an indigenous people or a nation. Historically, these groups have been excluded from power and exploited by elites. And it gets said a lot, but it's worth reiterating. Over Morales' 13-year tenure, income inequality went down by 2/3. Extreme poverty dropped from 38% to 17%. Hydrocarbons were nationalised, new infrastructure projects, social welfare, and to some extent healthcare provision really did transform the lives of poor people, women, particularly single mothers, and indigenous people in Latin America's poorest country. So I think related to this, the coup should be understood as an attack on the plurinational constitution of Bolivia. This might sound quite esoteric, but it's rooted in popular politics. In the aftermath of the coup, I saw a graffiti stamp, and Nick, we've got a picture, a graffiti stamp that simply says República de Bolivia, sketched on this was imprinted on the wall outside UMSA, the main university. It's a very simple, very unassuming, a seemingly very innocuous statement, but Bolivia was reconfigured as a plurinational state under the MAS in 2009. It marked a historic break with the Republic, which carries a legacy of Spanish colonization and later oligarchic rule under Spanish descendant elites. The plurinational state awarded unprecedented recognition, visibility, and also political autonomy to the 36 indigenous nations of Bolivia. Demands for a plurinational state were certainly around in the 1980s, but the March of Lowland Indigenous Peoples in 1990 for dignity, land and territory did much to put the demand for a plurinational constitution on the national agenda. And I think it can really be understood as a revolutionary transformation in Bolivia. It questions very fundamentally who the nation state is for and who it has historically excluded. Last year, Aymara feminist Adriana Guzman said, the coup d'etat is not just against the state, the government, but also the social movement organizations. So when you see República de Bolivia on walls, it's an attack on the plurinational project and everything that signified. So you can see in the iconography of the coup, attempts at counter-revolution and the desire to turn back time, to assert the values and restore the power of a Creole, non-indigenous political elite. Also outside UMSA was the main university in La Paz, was the phrase Indians out of UMSA. According to social media posts, long live Bolivia free from Indians was also chalked on roads by anti-mass blockaders. Now, it goes without saying, but incidents like these have also a deep historical significance. Yeah, there it is. In a deep historical significance. Obviously, a country with 500 years of colonial violence, and there wasn't universal suffrage until 1952. And until the later 20th century, there was still harassment. People still experienced harassment for wearing indigenous dress. So immediately after Morales' resignation, anti-mass protesters were filmed burning the huipala, the flag representing Andean indigenous peoples. Footage circulated of police in the city of Santa Cruz cutting off the huipala from their uniforms. The huipala is a powerful symbol of resistance to the centuries of exploitation, racial violence and social exclusion experienced by indigenous peoples in Bolivia. As Aymara writer Jesus Ascori wrote at the time, the burning of the huipala combined with the ousting of Morales made many feel as if the Indian was being expelled from power. I just want to touch also on the aspect of regional politics. So regional politics, regional interests have increasingly shaped Bolivian politics over the past 4 decades, and I think they played out very strongly in the coup last year. So the tropical lowland departments of Santa Cruz, Pando, Beni and Tarija, known as the Media Luna region, have been the nexus of regional class antagonism to Morales and the MAS. Since the 1970s, during the military dictatorship of Banza, the bourgeoisie in Santa Cruz began garnering power. So it's from Santa Cruz that we have the so-called mastermind of the coup, Camacho. President Áñez comes from Beni. Her party is the voice of lowland business interests there. Santa Cruz unilaterally declared departmental autonomy in 2006. In 2008, a civic strike in the lowland departments was accompanied by a wave of violence from the proto-fascist Cruceño Youth Union, including attacks on peasant activists. So it's important to note that there is a deep violence and a racism within this regional separatist movement. Santa Cruz itself is dominated by major latifundistas. Around 5 million hectares of its land remains in the hands of large landowners. Much of it accumulated during dictatorships in the 70s and 80s. If we go back further, we can see also a lot of this development arose out of agrarian reform in 1953, which saw the opening up of the eastern lowland areas for agricultural colonization, heralding a land grab by big business. And in cultural terms, this wealthy export-driven region, which sort of sees itself as a kind of modern mestizo region, could not be further from the highland indigenous political support base of Morales and the valleys as well. So the election in 2005 of Morales really signalled a reorientation of power away from the east, from the lowlands, towards these indigenous movements in the highlands and the valleys, displacing the preeminent position of Santa Cruz elites in national institutions and resource management. So these Santa Cruz elites have historically rejected Morales' syndicalist, anti-neoliberal and indigenous politics, and have been marginalised by the Andean flavour of the mass and the trade union movement. In recent years, the racism in the region has certainly not been covert. In 2004, during the Miss Universe beauty pageant, Miss Bolivia, aka Gabriela Oviedo, said, "Not all Bolivians are short, poor Indians. Where I come from, people are white, tall, and can speak English." So it's clear that this regional politics converges with racism and has shaped decisively opposition to the mass, and is very evident in how the coup unfolded and who instigated it. One of the other things I think it's important to reflect on is how really that Bolivia got to the stage where a leftist president could be ousted by the military, the police, and right-wing protest movements. And I think we have to think about the kind of strategies that the right used at the time. And one I'll elaborate on briefly here is how the right managed to rehabilitate itself in the months preceding the coup, particularly in relation to the environment. So in August and September in 2019, a couple of months before the coup, there were, people probably remember this because it was widely covered, but there were major fires in Chiquitania, a biodiverse dry forest region bordering the Amazon in the department of Santa Cruz. At least, pardon me, at least 4 million hectares were burnt, with catastrophic damage and loss of life to animals and fauna. The fires started because farmers were using slash and burn, a practice known as chequeo, which is a very routine agricultural tool. It's long been deployed by subsistence farmers in Bolivia, as around the world. And a decree passed in July by Morales had encouraged this. But especially high temperatures and I think the increased volume of fires meant that they got out of control. And these fires sparked massive protests in Santa Cruz, ostensibly about the fires, but actually drawing on this latent regional separatism and anti-mass sentiment in the region. So the protests reportedly attracted up to 1 million people in Santa Cruz. There were also protests in Cochabamba and La Paz. So SOS Chiquitania became a trending hashtag. And this is really where the foreign media comes in, and the Anglophone media. So The Guardian at this point declared Morales a murderer of nature, criticising Morales in stronger terms than Bolsonaro, who was presiding over the burning of the Amazon at an even more destructive rate. Some were also quick to describe the protests as a kind of mass environmentalist movement. someone declared Santa Cruz on the front lines of climate resistance in the global south. Unfortunately, even outlets like Novara Media published articles along this vein, sort of presenting the risings as if, you know, the kind of a spontaneous rising of the global south in the name of the environment. And nothing could have been further from the truth. And in fact, it was actually highly perverse, really, to argue that, because while the protests, I think, did relate in part to the forest fires, they were far from manifestations of grassroots environmentalism. You know, this is the region whose entire wealth is based on destructive monocrop agriculture. A study later published found that 50% of the fires occurred on the land of big soya agribusiness and cattle ranchers. They're the ones who are behind 80% of the deforestation in the area. So the movement of the kind of big agribusiness, the presence of agribusiness interests in the protests should be understood as an attempt to greenwash the far right and the right 2 months before what was going to be obviously a very crucial election. So presenting the movement as environmental in scope allowed the Santa Cruz opposition to co-opt a legitimate ecological struggle. And the opposition was really careful to use emotive language like ecocide, weaponizing a discourse of human rights and ecological rights, and really casting itself as a besieged minority under an authoritarian dictatorship. I know I haven't got much time. So yeah, and let's not forget it was Morales, after all, who enshrined the rights of Mother Earth in the Constitution. And there was some really good work done by an outlet called Grey Zone, I think, about some of the key figures and the key NGOs who really garnered a lot of attention with the Anglophone internet sphere around this. And of course, the irony is that when Áñez came into power in November, one of the first things she did was immediately ratify a decree opening up 10 million hectares of land in Beni for agricultural production. So I think, yeah, we have to be obviously very careful of the greenwashing right. Foreign media, I think, often will pick up their message without contextualizing it. Yeah, I'm aware I haven't probably got much time, so I'll leave it there. But hopefully I've offered a bit of background to the coup and brought out some key themes. And yeah, thank you. We'll hear from Ollie now.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Olivia. Some really, really interesting information there. And I think one of the very striking things that most people here remember when these events took place was the manifestation of aggressive hatred towards the indigenous population that was coming from the European descendant coup-monger class. That we saw Áñez going in with this kind of like extravagantly oversized Bible to announce that, you know, Christianity is back, was quite clearly the symbolism there. And also, as you mentioned, the burning of the Wipala flag. And we've actually got a video of that just to give an idea of like how this manifested and the sort of just level of hatred being put forward by the far right. So yeah, some really just like brutal, horrific scenes going from the kind of white European minority towards the majority of people there. But as Ollie is going to tell us, there's been some there's been very strong resistance towards the coup regime in Bolivia in the immediate aftermath, and I believe ongoing. So I'm very happy to introduce Ollie Vargas, again, who is a reporter at Calsachan News in Bolivia. Ollie, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm in the tropic of Cochabamba, which is in the center of the country, and this is is the strongest base of support for Evo Morales. And Evo Morales was once a union leader here before he became a politician. So I think Olivia touched on the way in which the coup happened, the sort of racist terror that was unleashed to be able to mobilize a certain section of the population along with the military, to get rid of Evo Morales. And I think just after that, what we saw was a number of massacres, killings. So going beyond that, however, what we saw was a much deeper terror and a sort of persecution that still exists to this day. So that includes the use, what some might call lawfare, as the use of sort of phony legal processes to threaten prominent leftists, prominent dissidents. And that's what we've seen with everyone from the movement towards socialism, Evo Morales' party. Whenever there's a new figure gaining sort of popularity, they're immediately hit with a proceso, sort of a legal threat. And I would characterize the post-coup period as sort of having three main parts. The first part was the kind of terror, the massacres immediately after the coup. The second part, I think, starting in about January, February, was a moment in which the MAS was starting to find its feet again and was holding a number of important election rallies, boosted by the fact that every opinion poll showed them sort of racing ahead, double-digit leads over any other right-wing candidates. But now I think in the sort of coronavirus phase, what we've seen is the state sort of massively take advantage of coronavirus to be able to sort of cement their grip on power and rule almost indefinitely. Now, I remember sort of going back to the period I said, sort of January, February time. I remember I traveled about with Andrónico Rodriguez, who is he's a union leader in this region in the Tropic of Cochabamba, and he's been touted as many as a sort of successor to Evo. He's sort of a young 30-year-old charismatic union leader, and what I saw with him, we went all around different parts of the country, sort of huge rallies, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm, of momentum behind the movement towards socialism. And it was a period where people were beginning to lose their fear to a large extent. And I think Olivia touched on the fact that in Bolivia you have a lot of sort of regional divides. So the east of the country, regions like Santa Cruz, Beni, Pandom, are sort of traditionally associated with the right, and they led some of the sort of destabilization attempts in the run-up to the coup. But actually what I saw there was, although regions like Santa Cruz are by majority sort of vote for the right, in fact, large sections of Santa Cruz, what you call the rural areas, as well as the working class urban areas, were beginning to regroup. The social movements there were beginning to regroup, and they were organizing to bring out the vote for the MAS. So we went to areas such as Yapacani, Plan 3000, which is a working class area in the city. It's one of the largest districts of the city. So even in areas such as Santa Cruz, sort of traditionally right-wing areas, the MAS was getting these huge sort of outpourings of support, of enthusiasm, and people who had been too scared to speak up, to sort of express their support for the movement towards socialism just after the coup, were finding their voice. And there's also regions such as Los Yungas of La Paz, which is a sort of coca-growing region just outside La Paz. And before the coup, there's a number of right-wing union leaders in that region who had tried to swing that region to support the coup. And in fact, Andrónico Rodriguez went there and was received like a hero. He was received like Evo Morales himself, like the heir to Evo Morales. And so I think despite all the persecution, despite all the massacres, all the terror that the regime spread within the wider population, the MAS remains the biggest party in the country. Every poll shows it, but also the streets show it. As I said, anywhere we went in the country with figures such as Andronica Rodriguez.
Okay, just while we wait for Ollie, again, just remember that you can get a copy of the Alborada 10, we call it, our new magazine, which is freely available. I think it's been shared already in the chat. And here's an example of Olivia's article written on the ground in Bolivia shortly after the events of the coup, which documented what was happening. So please, if you haven't got that, please do just email us and we'll happily send one to you. Please let all your friends know. Are we any closer to getting Ollie back? It's a real shame to have lost him there. It was really interesting what he was saying. Okay, perhaps Olivia, would you like to respond a little more to what Ollie was saying?
Hang on, I think we have him back there, do we?
We've got him back. Okay, yeah. Brilliant. We'll come back to you afterwards for a chance to follow up to both of you, as well as to everyone else as well. Good, great to have you back, Ollie. We lost you for a moment, but you know.
Yeah, sorry about that. Rural areas.
The joys of the new reality of online events.
Yeah. But yeah, as I was saying, despite the coup, I think the social movements in Bolivia, specifically the campesino, indigenous social movements in the rural areas and the working class areas of the cities, had begun a process of regrouping to be able to face down the coup. And however, as we enter the period of the lockdown, of quarantine, coronavirus, the government has had a great time in lockdown. They've been able to ban all political rallies, which is sort of the strongest weapon that the mass has to take on the coup. This ability to mobilize people in the streets. So the conditions of lockdown, sort of being able to arrest anyone that goes outside their home, accuse them of, in Bolivia you say, atentado contra la salud, an attack against public health. And so any sort of manifestation of sort of popular discontent is just labelled as an attack on public health, or you're breaking quarantine. And we saw that a few weeks ago when a number of protests broke out right across the country, in working class areas of the cities, especially in Cochabamba and El Alto, where people who'd been left with nothing during this lockdown, people who work in the informal economy and who had lost their income, they began protesting, demanding food and demanding democratic elections. And the government immediately said, these people are terrorists, these people are, are making an attack on public health during a time of emergency, during a time of coronavirus. Everyone should be focused on coronavirus and not on democracy, not on, human rights and these sorts of things. So despite all of this, all of the violence, all of the repression that Olivia outlined, and some of the ways in which I've outlined, the movement towards socialism remains as the strongest party in the country. So however strong the grip of the regime is, they don't have a social base. So the chances of being able to defeat this coup are certainly there. The social organization at the union level, at the sort of social movement level, is there. And in a free and fair election, the mass can win. And if the government tries to commit fraud in this election, real fraud, or if they try to shut down the possibility of any elections, then the mass has a social base within the entire country, which has the ability to start an insurgency that can make the country ungovernable. But if we enter into a phase like that, what we'll see is a pretty serious level of repression, possibly even unseen until this point. So I think it's important for people around the world to keep an eye on Bolivia, to sort of express solidarity with the social movement that are risking their lives and running up against the violence of a US-backed, unelected coup regime. And I think, especially as we come up to any possible elections, that will become even more important. The electoral authorities have just announced about an hour ago that the date that they suggest that they'll be suggesting to the legislature to hold elections is the 6th of September. So that's 3 months away. That'll mean that Bolivia will have lived through 9 months of unelected government. But if the MAS are able to win this election, will be because the election is fair, and the election will only be fair if the regime thinks that they won't be able to get away with rigging it, which is why it's so important that people around the world sort of keep their eyes on Bolivia and call out, and shine a light on all the abuses and all the terror and all the persecution that's going on. And when we get to the point of the elections, if they try to rig the elections, it's important for everyone to speak out about something like that. And we hope to be able to bring you all of the latest information in that respect.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ollie. That was really, really interesting, really important to get that update, particularly around the elections. I mean, I'd just like to kind of raise, are you confident that there could be free and fair elections? I mean, having gone to these lengths and committed the human rights abuses that they've committed to get themselves back in power, I mean, and obviously with US backing in this, because in Bolivia's case, you know, the economy did very well under Morales. They don't have that excuse that they've tried to put there with Venezuela, that, you know, there's an economic crisis and therefore the government has failed the people, blah, 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 like these kinds of attacks they've put towards Venezuela. They didn't have that excuse in the case of Bolivia. Do you think that the US would allow, and the Bolivian far right, do you think there's any chance within this environment of free and fair elections actually being able to go ahead?
I think most people are not confident that there will be free and fair elections. I mean, already it's not free insofar as one of the contending organizations, which is the MAS, is persecuted. But I think there's also a number of other ways. For example, the USAID has re-entered Bolivia after being expelled under Evo, and they're going to be directly involved in the organization, in the sort of physical organization of the election. So one of the key organizations holding this has a history of coming into conflict with one of the parties, the MAS. So even on that level, it's not a free and fair election. And of course, as you said, the regime does have the backing of the US. So how far are they comfortable going, knowing that whatever they do, they will have that US backing? As I said earlier, I think it's very possible that on the day that they will also rig the elections. And if that happens, the MAS has an ability to sort of call for an insurrection right across the country. But if we get to that stage, that will essentially be a sort of civil war. So I think the important work to do is now. The important work is to keep sort of shining a light on Bolivia. So the more the world is watching, the less likely the regime is to try and rig the elections. And I think they're obviously very nervous about the elections, the government, because they know they have an extremely low approval rating. Áñez is third in the polls, and you've got to remember that the economy at this point is in freefall. There was an economic crisis before lockdown because of the fact that, you know, the regime had cut public spending to a huge degree, cut a number of sort of huge public infrastructure projects, had begun dismantling the nationalized state companies. So the economy was already in crisis before lockdown. It's going to be in even more of a crisis by the end of it, by September, which is when the elections should be. So there's very little chance that they'll be able to win fairly. So if they haven't finished their project of privatizing the country's natural resources and sort of repressing social movements, if they haven't finished that by September, then I'm sure that they'll try to rig the election.
Great. Okay. Just before we I see we've got a couple of questions. If you do have any questions, please do stick them in the chat, and you can either ask it yourself, or if you prefer not to, I'm happy to read it out. I'd just like to give Olivia a chance to respond to what Ollie said, if you'd like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. That was great. I suppose one thing I'd just add, I mean, I'm not there now, obviously, but it does seem from over here that it's just an incredibly unstable regime. Huge numbers of resignations happening. Latest, I think, is the health minister, who resigned after a sort of corruption, basically spending too much money on ventilators to deal with the COVID crisis that didn't even work in ICU wards. That the regime is just very unstable, and that it might that would sort of impact how it can kind of retain power. That's all I have to add, really. But
okay, so we've got a question here from David Raby. I don't know, does David want to read it himself? Okay, yeah, so David's going to ask the question, so we can get the camera on David, please. Is David here? Hi, David. Good. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Great to see you.
Yes, and you. I was wondering what the situation is in the military and police. I mean, I remember some years ago, Evo had established a Center for Strategic Defense Studies, where supposedly Bolivian officers studied alongside Venezuelans and Cubans and others from ALBA countries with anti-imperialist values. But obviously that collapsed, or something, the military were obviously very well subverted by right-wing interests. And I wonder what the situation might be now.
Thank you.
Can I come back to that?
Okay, yeah, Ollie, if you'd like to answer, and then Olivia, obviously, you're more than welcome to also answer.
Yeah, I think that's will probably turn out to be an incredibly important question, especially if there's more social conflicts in the country. But I think just after the coup, the military was very united behind what was going on, behind the new regime, and it showed the fact that there wasn't the level of ideological political change within the institutions of the state in Bolivia, well, at least not as much as it occurred in countries like Venezuela or Cuba, where the institutions of the state were at one with sort of revolutionary politics of the political moment. Whereas in Bolivia, the coup showed that the army that exists now is very much the military establishment that existed before Evo Morales, and that there wasn't a great deal of work done during the 14 years that Evo governed to change that. That's not to say that there aren't sections of the military that are not happy at all with what's going on, and that's why, for example, at the moment, Agnes is trying to reorganize the military. She sort of signed off on a load of military promotions, but then that, under the constitution, that has to be approved by the legislature, and they refuse to do that. So there's a conflict around that issue, because she knows that there are sections of the military who will have been promoted under Evo and who are still loyal to that. So she's trying to reorganize things, but unfortunately, the bigger picture is that there wasn't an attempt to sort of to change the state institution in the way that Venezuela's done. That's why in Venezuela they've managed to fend off, how many coup attempts now? Numerous. Seems like numerous coup attempts every year, and that's because they have a military that's much more solid, that has a direct link to the people and to the revolutionary sort of social movements that have led the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. That didn't occur in Bolivia, which is part of why we're in the situation we're in now.
Okay, Olivia, would you like to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I'll just add something about the police, actually. So I think one of the really sort of decisive points as the coup was unfolding was when the police mutinied. And that suddenly was a big game changer, I think. And I mean, the police are, notoriously corrupt, underpaid. They immediately got a pay increase. Well, not immediately, but Agnes promised them a pay increase. So I think, the role of the police in this sort of how it unfolded was quite decisive. Just thought I'd add something about the police.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks, David. Our next question is from Joe Morley. And Joe asks, Ollie mentioned that the world needs to keep their eyes on Bolivia and speak up if there is any foul play. How can we as individuals do this? Write to our local MP perhaps, but what would you recommend? So again, that question, she mentioned Ollie, but perhaps we'll start with you, this time, Olivia.
I'll jump in first. I think, things like writing to your MP is important, but I think even just sharing what's going on, sort of creating sort of a consensus within the UK, within other countries abroad, that's incredibly important, because if you can create a sense of solidarity in countries abroad, then I think that's incredibly important for social movements here, because it means they'll feel that they're not alone in the struggle, and also those governments in those countries abroad will feel less obliged to follow the US in supporting massacres, in supporting sort of persecution, torture. And so people in Bolivia are crying out for people to just to see what's going on. They're not calling for foreign armies to come in, but they're calling for sort of popular movements around the world to understand what's going on and to sort of call on their government to not follow the US in providing support for this regime.
Okay, Olivia, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think one thing that during the pro-Evo marches during the coup, the refrain on all of the marches was "Where is the press?" And I think there was a huge lack of press, and I think still is a massive lack of press coverage of what is happening in Bolivia. And but at the same time, the press coverage that does exist is often quite unreliable, and you should also on Twitter. I mean, there's a big movement, the petitas, the golpista.
Sorry, Olivia, we've just got a few. As you continue answering that question, okay. I'm just going to ask if we can bring up a couple of images of headlines that from the kind of liberal international English language press that came out around the time of the coup. All these headlines very much put in the focus on, like, this was the responsibility of Evo Morales. So let's just give some examples. So please continue.
Yeah, but also from Bolivian media, I mean, it was quite remarkable how as soon as Evo was ousted, suddenly the media in Bolivia changed. Obviously, the national press changed its title even. So in addition to a sort of a general lack of press coverage, that which did exist was highly pro-coup. I'm just looking at these, and of course coverage in Europe I think was quite uneven. I was talking about the petitas, the so-called, often quite a youth-based movement. These were the people out doing bloqueos. They were the ones who were pro-coup. A lot of them were very sort of kind of Instagram sort of influencers, obviously very right-wing, but they garnered, I think, a lot of traction on sort of Bolivian Twitter. And even the British ambassador in La Paz started tweeting about the petitas. So I think that you have to be careful what kind of voices you're listening to as well. From, obviously listen to Bolivian voices, but remember that what their class background, class interests are.
Great. Okay. Just apologies. I think I made a mistake before. The question about what we can do came from Luke. I'd said it had come from Joe Morley. So I'll give you Joe's question now. Apologies, Joe. Apologies, Luke. So from Joe Morley, can you update us on whether Agnes has made constitutional changes as yet? Thinking of her images holding a Bible at the inauguration. So any constitutional changes which have so far been made under the coup regime?
Well, no, they haven't made any legal changes, but under dictatorship, rules and laws and things don't matter. And the sort of political forces that she represents on sort of the Bolivian right have long called for constitutional changes, which they haven't implemented, but which in effect they're doing in practice. So things, they've long called to scrap the plurinational state of Bolivia and to re-establish the republic. They've long called to sort of get rid of the Huipala flag as an official flag. They've long called to sort of de-link the participation of the social movements in the state, which existed under Evo. And although they haven't made the constitutional legal changes to do this, this is in effect what has been going on. So the whole point of creating a plurinational state, the whole point of creating mechanisms in which social movements, indigenous groups could sort of negotiate with the state, that's all been broken down. That's all broken down in practice. And the sort of equality and the sort of democratizing access to power, that has all been shut down. And now all of the sort of state apparatus that existed under Evo has been scrapped. And now she's brought in sort of her own allies from her own party, mostly from her own region in the Department of Beni, who are mostly sort of connected to the landlord class in the east of the country, and a number of sort of older figures of the sort of the ancien regime that was overthrown when Evo first came to power. So they're reconfiguring the sort of basis of the state without, creating the legal sort of constitutional framework for it. So yeah, as I said, in dictatorship, rules and laws don't mean much. What matters is what you do in practice, and it's easy to see what they're doing in practice.
Thanks very much. Okay, our next question is from Jeremy Fox. Hi, Jeremy. Great to see you here. I think Jeremy's going to ask the question himself, so perhaps we get the video on Jeremy. Are you with us, Jeremy?
Hello, can you hear me?
There he is. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too. Yeah, my question is this. I remember discussing US efforts to create problems for Evo and his government during its very early days. I remember discussing this with a politician from Potosi, and he was in no doubt then that the United States was attempting to interfere with the government. And I wonder if you could say a little more, that is, our experts could say a little more about the nature of US interference in Bolivia now, and also in the wider context of Latin America, in particular Colombia and Venezuela.
Okay, Olivia, would you like to come in on that first, and then we'll go to Ollie afterwards?
Yeah, I may depart from Ollie and others here. I don't think the US played a decisive role in this coup, to be honest, and others may disagree with me there. Obviously, historically, Bolivia under Morales and the US did have a fractious relationship. As Ollie mentioned, US aid was expelled. Also in the in coca policy, Bolivia marked an absolute transformation in the strategy for coca eradication, moving to a model of self-policing by coca unions, limiting the amount of coca, but moving away from the US's desire to impose a policy where coca was just burned, in a highly militarized zone, often accompanied by violence, torture. So in that sense, yeah, obviously Bolivia has taken a very different trajectory and has, been praised widely for this, for its stance on coca, which differs from the US. And yeah, so in that sense, I just think we can overplay the role of the US in this. I mean, obviously, elites in Bolivia have connections with the US. We know that there are flows of capital that connect elite activities, business interests in Bolivia. But I think this arose out of a sort of domestic, the dynamics of Bolivian domestic politics is my own view. And in that sense, I think Bolivia is sort of different from Venezuela, as we've seen, recently, when, the US just have never kind of stopped trying to kind of involve themselves in Venezuela. But I mean, I accept others will probably disagree with me on this point, but that's my own view.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. Ollie, would you like to come back on that?
Well, I think the US was deeply involved in the coup, not only in sort of building the coup, but also in managing the situation now. So first of all, Agnes's most senior chief advisor is a man called Eric Foronda. Eric Foronda was seconded from the US Embassy in Bolivia, where he held the same role as senior advisor, and he was at the US Embassy for 25 years. So long before Evo Morales ever came to power, before he was even a national figure. So that's how he's been managing Bolivia on behalf of the US for a very long time. And I think another important way the US created the coup and is managing it now is through the media. So I've been doing an investigation this past couple of weeks on the role of the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a State Department sort of NGO, of the US government State Department. And they're involved in almost every part of the Bolivian mainstream media. They fund one of the main, they directly fund one of the most famous and oldest media outlets, which is called Agencia Fides. Agencia Fides received sort of $80,000 from the NED in the 2 years leading up to the coup. They also fund a number of NGOs. One is called the Fundación para Periodismo, the Foundation for Journalism, which provides training for people who then go into the mainstream media. And that is an organization that received huge amounts, almost $100,000 from the NED in the 2 years leading up to the coup. And there's a number of sort of projects around fact-checking, around sort of other projects related to journalism, sort of think tanks, things like this, which are all funded by this State Department organization. So what that creates is through that is able to shape the media discourse in Bolivia. And the media discourse was key because it was through that in which they destabilized the country and sort of provoked the middle class sections of the country to protest, to riot in the run up to the coup, to create the destabilization that meant that the conditions existed for the military and the police to step in and impose the current regime. So I think the US was crucial in developing the Bolivian right. The Bolivian right is quite a weak force, but with US support, they were able to achieve what they've achieved and to continue ruling in the way that they are.
Okay, thank you for that, both of you. Our next question, I think, is coming from Rachel and Sequoia. I think they want to ask it themselves, so if we can get the camera on, I think it's Rachel's name, to ask the next question. Do we have it?
There we go.
Yeah, here we go. Hi, guys.
Hey, guys.
Thanks for joining us.
No problem at all.
Okay, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so just thinking about the international reaction to the coup, both at the time and since, what was the UN's response being? And I'm thinking in particular the General Assembly, because beyond Western imperialist states, I mean, their reaction, I'm sure it was music to their ears to have Evo Morales removed from power, but also individually, what can we do to help the restoration of democracy in Bolivia?
Okay. Can I come?
Yeah, please.
Come back from that? Well, I think the UN has been an important institution this past 6 months because it's been a means, an institution to which social movements that are being persecuted can denounce what's going on. So the unions in this region, in the Tropic of Cochabamba, led by Andrónico Rodriguez, they took the persecution they were facing to the Office of Human Rights at the UN. And I think just the act of doing that sort of scared off the regime somewhat. It helped them sort of back away a little bit. So I think the role of the human rights role of the UN has been important and will continue being important, certainly. But in terms of what people can sort of do individually, I think just even the act of talking about what's going on and not letting it slip away from public discourse, public sort of consciousness, that is incredibly important. Because, as I said earlier, if the Bolivian government think that no one is watching and that no one cares, then they can do whatever. But if they feel that the world is watching them, then they will back away. And like, as I was saying earlier, when these social movement leaders in this region took the case of a case to the UN, and that was about a month ago, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And that was because the government had cut off access to the banks in this region, which has stopped people withdrawing their money in punishment for the fact that people here had expelled the police in a popular protest about a month ago. So, as I said, the people in this region took that case to the UN, and the government got scared and backed away. So, if the government feels that everyone's watching, then they're more likely to back away and not, persecute people in the way that they would want to.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Olivia, did you want to add anything?
Just very briefly, yeah, I completely agree with Ollie. I think the UN is a powerful actor. It has been, historically a forum in which Morales has made obviously very lauded statements about the environment, about indigenous rights, and so on. And also, initially, I think in the coup, I think that kind of the battle for PR is a big one. And initially, I think there have been NGOs, particularly those that operate in English, that have tried to acquire a sort of international audience, and would do this under the banner of authority, under Morales saying Bolivia is in an authoritarian dictatorship, and I think really what's happened now is that kind of rhetoric has lost completely its traction as the world has seen the kind of human rights abuses and the violence that's taken place in the coup. So so I think those appeals to international audience under that banner of human rights has really sort of fallen away since in recent months.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot for your question. Thanks very much for both of you for your answers. Our next question is from Camilla, and I think Camilla is going to read the question. So if we could get the camera on Camilla, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Nick, Olivia, and Ollie. Just walking through the office here.
Okay.
So my question was on the law of guarantees and social protection, or protection for social leaders and mass leaders, of course, and if that can be upheld in this period between now and the election, if the election's to be held on September 6th, and also how something like that could be extended to cover journalists, because of course we had a lot of difficulties covering things on the ground and fear of persecution ourselves. Some people were persecuted.
Thanks. Shall I come in on that one quickly? I'd say that there was a law proposed in the legislature called the Law of Guarantees just after the coup to try and protect specifically social movement leaders from being persecuted, because almost the whole of the old leadership of the social movement is either now in exile or in jail or in hiding. So it's incredibly important to keep the social movement together, to have those sort of human rights guarantees. However, the executive, the president, blocked it, and so it was modified to sort of water it down a little bit, and it was passed. But you won't hear much about it because it essentially doesn't matter very much, because there's a number of very good laws in Bolivia which are not being implemented at the moment. Of course, an unelected government has no need to respect precedent and rules. So I think the main way that the movement towards socialism have been protecting themselves is by sort of following a very careful strategy of, talking very clearly about what's going on, but not throwing the country into sort of massive social conflict until it's absolutely necessary. I said before that the mass has the capacity to, drag the country into a drawn-out conflict, possibly even a civil war. But they're not mobilizing that capacity at the moment. Their focus is, number one, on maintaining peace until there can be elections, and elections in which the MAS would win. And that is the way they want to take power. And if that can't happen, if they can't win the democratic way, if there's fraud at the elections, or if the elections don't happen, then that's the moment in which the social power of the MAS will be realized. And that power has been tested in some ways. The protests that were taking place a few months ago blocked all, most of the key highways in the country, and it really shook the regime, and they weren't able to repress them straight away. They weren't able to clear them away after a day or two. They continued for about a week. So that's the sort of social power that the MAS can mobilize. The indigenous social movements that are affiliated to the party are present across the whole country, even in the east of the country, which is traditionally right wing. They have a presence there. They have the ability to block the main roads of those regions, to block food going into those regions, to paralyze economic production in those regions, as well as in the Andean regions. So the strategy of the MAS is to maintain social peace until they can win democratically. And if that's impossible, then we will enter into a period of social struggle. But that's the only protection that they can rely on, is their ability to mobilize and their ability to keep the peace, because no kind of laws, no kind of rules protects anyone when you're living under a dictatorship that doesn't respect laws or rules.
Thanks a lot, Ollie. Olivia, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, not much to add, but just that, there have been large numbers of journalists prosecuted, imprisoned, including one famous feminist blogger who was arrested, and she was actually a student at UMSA. The rector at the time, Albarracin, he was a prominent member of CONADE, the so-called pro-democracy movement, refused to intervene, I think, on behalf of his own student who was imprisoned under the regime. So yeah, I think it's obviously it's a dangerous time, and I don't think there has been any meaningful protection.
Great. Okay, so thanks a lot for that. Thanks to Camilla for the question. And just so everyone, for your information, Camilla will be joining us, one of our speakers, a journalist at Telesur and other outlets. Camilla will be joining us as one of our speakers at our event, Latin American Media and kind of how the international media reports on Latin America, which is on the 16th of June, so 2 weeks from today. Our speakers are Camilla, the journalist Matt Kennard, whose work some of you might be familiar with, who's done a lot on Latin America, including Bolivia, and also my Alborada co-editor colleague, Pablo Navarrete, with myself chairing. So that's on the 16th of June. Really looking forward to hearing more from Camilla, Matt and Pablo then. So we've got 3 more questions lined up from William, Sarah and Adam. We've got about 20 minutes, so hopefully plenty of time to go through all of them. I'll read out William's question. So gas and lithium in Bolivia are in the books for extraction for free. What economic decisions have been already taken by the new regime that make evident this strategy of favouring foreign interest that was behind the coup against Evo Morales? So in what way has the new regime prioritised foreign multinational and capitalist interests over those of the Bolivian people? Olivia, I would like to start with you on that question, please.
Yeah, the lithium question is an interesting one, and I've seen a lot of divided opinion about this. So Bolivia has one of the largest lithium reserves in the country, and just before the coup, Morales sort of broke away or didn't sign a contract with a German firm to extract the lithium. This was actually at the heart of a lot of protests between Morales and the city of Potosí, which is nearest to where the lithium reserves are. And I've seen, again, a lot of sort of divided opinion about this, because there is a lot of debate whether the lithium, it's highly expensive to extract. It's also not even certain if it's possible to extract. So I think this, again, I'm hesitant to say, oh, it was a kind of a grab for lithium, and I have seen that argument made. I'm not sure there's a whole huge amount of evidence to say that there was a kind of desire for lithium in the coup, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes there were some debate over that. In terms of what other decisions, economic decisions have been made, so I think there's certainly one of the ministers, who I think might have now resigned actually, gave a television interview where they talked about trying to privatize a lot of the state assets. And I think adopting or trying to buy into a neoliberal model of government is certainly is what the opposition in its sort of heterogeneous form wants, obviously kind of going against the model of nationalization that the MAS has famously developed over the past few years. So yeah, absolutely. I think this is going to be a major sort of focus, a major frame that, you know, for the kind of policies that we might see coming out. Whoever, you know, I don't think the opposition will win, but that's another debate. But I think, yeah, this is definitely control over national assets is at the heart. In a country so dependent on extractivism, it's highly central to political economy.
Great, thanks, Olivia. Ollie, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, I think Evo Morales was swept to power on the promise of nationalizing the natural gas reserves, which he did in the first year in 2006. And I think from there is, you know, he's been on a collision course with the US. And the issue of lithium is quite important to the coup, I think. And we saw that even before the coup took place. So one of the key leaders of the right-wing protest movement that, you know, tried to overthrow Evo Morales is a guy called Marco Pumari in the region of Potosi, which is where the lithium is. And even before the coup started, they were protesting against a deal that Evo had made with a German company to exploit the lithium, in which the Bolivian state company would have over majority control and a German company would have minority control and then contribute the investment that's needed. I think you know, I've spoken to people from that region. They say that it was a good deal with some things to improve, but there's a deal that gave Bolivians control, majority control over that natural resource. And what they were going to do is actually industrialize it. That means they weren't just going to extract it and sort of sell it to be processed in a, you know, Elon Musk's Tesla factory. What they were going to do is build a factory in Bolivia that could produce batteries, that could produce electric cars, the sort of things that lithium are useful for. So that, I think, presents a threat to a kind of global division of labor that benefits the US and the global north. And that project, since the coup, that project is over, officially over. There's all of the work that was being done is paralyzed. Those factories that I talked about, which were beginning to start up, were beginning to produce some batteries, have now been paralyzed. The workers are not working in those factories anymore, and that's because they want to privatize it. And the Minister of Economy has already said that you know, the way that we'll reactivate the economy is through inviting multiple foreign companies in to work the lithium. They've already cancelled the German contract. They're going to invite others. I suspect the US will be one of those others. So yeah, I think the issue of natural resources is incredibly important to Bolivia. It's why the US has long been intervening in Bolivia. It wasn't just the coup that the US intervened in. When there was the first coup attempt in 2008, 2009, WikiLeaks cables show how the US was funneling money to the groups involved. And all of this is, all of this hostility between Evo Morales' government and the US is because of the issue of natural resources.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ollie. Thanks a lot, Olivia. Our next question comes from Sarah Lowry. Sarah asks, is there any clear charismatic figures to succeed as leader of the MAS in the future? Obviously, Morales is such a central figure and very much the face of the movement. Do you think there will be a power vacuum if he goes? Ollie, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I think when Morales was president, a lot of people would say that, oh, you know, he's a caudillo, he doesn't want to be replaced, he's not training any sort of up-and-coming people. But I think that's not true. I think Evo Morales went to great pains to sort of promote and to train up the person I've been talking about in the first part during my introduction as Andrónico Rodriguez, the union leader in this region. He's now a Senate candidate. And of course, the two presidential candidates are key figures during Evo's government. That's Luis Arce, he's the presidential candidate. He was the Minister of the Economy for the entire time that Evo was president. There was a period he was actually off due to illness, but you know, while he was in the country, he was Minister of Economy under Evo. He created the economic model of nationalizing natural resources and strategic industries that turned Bolivia into the fastest growing economy in the region. So he's an incredibly important figure. And he's also someone that can draw in sections in the middle class. I mean, he's a middle class white guy. He's actually, he did his MA at Warwick University in economics. And he's seen as a sort of technician, but he has a sort of strong socialist commitment. He came into the mass because he ran a Marxist study circle around Marxist economists. So he's very important. Another important figure is David Choquehuanca, who's the vice presidential candidate at the moment, and he has a huge amount of support among the indigenous social movements. He's indigenous himself. He's sort of seen as an indigenous intellectual. When he was foreign minister under Evo Morales, he promoted the idea of the vivir bien, the well-being, an indigenous sort of concept of harmony between man and Mother Earth and things like this. So I think there's a number of important figures within the movement towards socialism who have a social base amongst social movements, and where they don't, people like Luis Arce, who isn't a worker or from the social movements, but he still has a huge amount of sort of respect within the country. So I think these figures will help the mass maintain their position as the largest party in the country.
Thanks a lot, Ollie. Olivia, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, just quickly to add, I mean, I definitely think the narrative around Evo Morales not having a successor was very popular, and especially sort of Anglophone media, because I think people wanted to buy into this idea of this sort of dictatorship kind of figure. That was certainly something played up by a lot of the sort of anti-mass Bolivian figures as well. But I think it's totally, as Ollie has said, it's a pluralistic party. There are also a number of women who've been active as well and are active in the party, and it's certainly a narrative we should resist. I think it's totally a constructed sort of phenomenon.
Great. Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, could I just add one thing quickly to that? I think the most prominent woman in the party right now is the leader of the Senate. She's called Eva Copa. And there's actually quite an interesting relationship between her and the party. I think just after the coup, a lot of people saw her as a bit of a sort of collaborationist, a bit of a traitor maybe, because she was working to sort of reconcile with the government in some ways. But now she's taken a much more combative position. She's been forceful in calling for elections, forceful in defending the legislature against the regime. So she's actually got she's got much more support within the party right now. And she actually called in, we interviewed her on the radio here at Calçados and Coca on our evening show. And, got a huge amount of feedback in the comments of people sort of coming and saying, expressing support for Eva Copa. So I think she could be an interesting figure for the mass coming up.
Okay, really interesting. So definitely quite a lot of stuff to keep an eye on these developments and who the mass might be putting its hopes in future. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes left, and we've got at least 2 more questions. I don't know if we'll be able to get any more than that in. Obviously, if we can, we will. Our first next question, if that's the correct way to say it, I've just scrolled past. Where is it? Here we go. This is from Adam Samuels. Great to hear from Adam. So Adam asks, this is a UK-focused question. Alborada is based in the UK, but we hope there's people from all over the world tuning in. It's a bit of a UK focus to hear. Are we aware of any change of stance within the UK Labour Party towards Bolivia en masse? Now, Jeremy Corbyn is no longer leader. A little bit of background, Corbyn, of course, was very critical of the coup. He just last week tweeted a picture of him with Evo Morales, taken at some point in the not too distant past, expressing solidarity with Evo and with the people of Bolivia who, you know, have had a far-right authoritarian regime imposed on them. Corbyn actually was quite heavily criticised in the British media over this. We don't really have time to go into that, but that's certainly another issue that I think drove a lot of the kind of liberal bourgeois media to attack certain elements of Evo Morales. There was a point of legitimising the political opposition in Britain. But Olivia, can we come to you on this? So Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn was leader. Yeah. Obviously, Keir Starmer took over about 2 months ago as leader of the UK Labour Party. Are you aware of any change in stance towards Bolivia since Starmer took over?
Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Labour has put out a policy position on Bolivia. However, I would not be surprised if they completely, I mean, they probably don't want to touch it for the reasons you just mentioned. It has always been a kind of red baiting stick around, you know, to beat Jeremy Corbyn with. I wouldn't be surprised if this was the election of Starmer did sort of signal the end of that kind of outward expressions of solidarity with so-called pink tide leaders like Morales. That would be that's what I suspect is going to happen. It might not be, but I don't think there's been any evidence to show that they're going one way or the other right now.
Ollie, I don't know much info about UK politics out there, but
yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not in the UK anymore, but when I was in the UK, I was active in the Labour Party, and I remember when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, that is, and you know, I remember there was a political culture in which people could talk about issues of international solidarity, things like Palestine, wars abroad, wars in the Middle East, and solidarity with Latin America, with Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and I haven't been in the UK since Keir Starmer took over, but I hope that political culture doesn't die. I'm sure they want it to die. I'm sure Keir Starmer wants to sort of get rid of that sort of chat. But I think it's something that individual Labour Party members can do, is to keep that culture of international solidarity alive, even if the leadership wants to kill it off.
And there are grassroots groups affiliated or, you know, linked to the Labour Party there's the Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America, Friends of Bolivia, which have like Labour Party activists involved. So do look them up if you are interested in how the Labour Party is reacting to Bolivia in this space and time. We've got 5 minutes to go. Unfortunately, I've got a question from Rodrigo. I don't think we're going to have time for any more questions after this. But Rodrigo says, the OAS appears to be involved in this coup. And according to a friend who was staying at the same hotel as some officials at the time, who was working on the OAS audit of results, blatant realpolitik at times to help legitimize the coup. Institutions such as these reflect the power politics at play. Surely the international left should be monitoring such institutional actors for future elections. This was actually a question I had in case we didn't get any, but I also want to add something to that. Has there been any accountability of the OAS for its role in completely destabilizing and overthrowing democracy in Bolivia? We'll start with you, Ollie. And we've got to keep this relatively brief, unfortunately, because we've only got 2 minutes left.
No, I think the OAS has proved itself to be, an organization dedicated only to implementing US policy in Latin America. And we can see that now by the fact that they've been silent on the crisis, the unprecedented crisis, certainly in my lifetime unprecedented, going on in the US right now. And the sort of repression, police violence, that Americans are facing right now, the OAS is saying nothing. But when Evo Morales governed for 14 years as, as a Democrat, as maintaining Bolivian democracy in which people's rights were respected, he'll now call that, a dictatorship, authoritarian regime. I don't know how exactly he would describe it, Luis Almagro, that is. But like he did say when just after the coup that the real coup was by Evo Morales. So this is the kind of organization that the OAS is. So I think it's important going forward to reconfigure sort of certain international institutions. I think the UK has a role to play in that, in not legitimizing organizations such as the OAS and various ways in which the US implement foreign policy abroad.
I will come to you in a second, Olivia. Sorry, just to clarify, for anyone who's not familiar with the OAS, the Organization of American States, it's a international regional organization formed of all the different states within the Americas, North, Central and South America, which was the original source that the Evo Morales victory was fraudulent. And then that was used to legitimize the coup. The OAS has a very, very long history of upholding US interests in the region and is very, very much involved in the attempts to destabilize Venezuela, Nicaragua, and completely silent on issues in Brazil, in human rights violations in Colombia, all over the place. And as Ollie just said, in the US. So yeah, Olivia, if you could briefly respond, and I'm afraid that will have to be our last contribution from our fantastic speakers.
Yeah, completely. Honduras as well is the major one, I think, with the OAS in terms of supporting the US's role in destabilizing the region. In terms of Bolivia, I think the OAS is absolutely a central actor in allowing the coup to take place. So Morales initially said he welcomed in the OAS when there was the kind of protests were starting to take place from anti-Morales forces. The cry of fraud started to develop. Morales said, "Yep, the OAS, you can come in, do a review, do an audit of the election results." They then come in. They then released this report early. It actually came a few days early at an incredibly tense time, in a way that was calculated to exacerbate tensions on the ground. And bearing in mind that, this was a time of political violence. And I think the OAS definitely, the question of accountability, they should be held accountable for that. The other thing is the report that was only in relation to the provisional results from this, so the TREP, the provisional results, not the actual results. So they kind of had, basically they staked an awful lot of, they basically overreached in the decision that they came to, that there was sort of not fraudulent, irregularities. So they didn't quite say it was fraud to cover themselves, but that was basically what they were implying. They were part of buying into this discourse that was developing at the time. So the OAS really needs to be held accountable for that. One thing about who has been fantastic at this is the Centre for Economic Policy Reform, a think tank. Guillaume Long, who's been associated with the left in Ecuador, has been involved with them. They've did a kind of total debunking of the OAS report. And they've been really fantastic at sort of exposing the kind of the problems with the OAS's report. But absolutely, they have a long history of destabilizing the region, and yeah.
Well, on that note, I would just like to say thank you very much to Ollie. Thank you very much to Olivia. You can follow them both on Twitter. Make sure you do, because they're very, very important sources of information on what's taking place in Bolivia, and I'm sure plenty of other issues as well. So thanks guys, and hope to see you both again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, and
thanks to everyone.
Brilliant stuff. Really appreciate it. That's it. Just before we end this event, we will leave the meeting open for 15 minutes with a playlist playing, and the chat will be open. So please post any links, any other questions. Really sorry that we didn't get round to answering or asking all of the questions, but we could go on for ages and ages with this. Finally, I see Pablo's been sharing it. please, please, please support Alborada. You know, grassroots independent media at times like this, issues like what's happening in Bolivia, in Venezuela, and of course what's now happening in the US. You know, if what was happening in the US was taking place in Bolivia or Venezuela, they'd be calling for foreign intervention, you know. So, you know, please support grassroots media. All help is massively, massively appreciated. Please get hold of get your copy of our digital magazine if you haven't yet got it. Lots of really interesting stuff in there. And finally, thank you again to Olivia. Thank you again to Ollie. Thank you to Ricardo and Simon, who are our puppet masters behind the scenes. Couldn't do this without them. And thanks to everyone for attending. The 14th of June, our event on Chile. 16th of June, our event on the media and Latin America. So thanks a lot. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye-bye.